Okay. Good evening. I'm out here at the pool. It's just a beautiful afternoon here in Durban. And so I've opted again for, at the risk of the noise and possibly a little bit of wind, to be out here where it's really, really nice and cool. Really, really humid here in the summer down on the east coast of Africa. Anyway, I've got coffee out here, and I'm just really excited to spend a couple of moments with all of you. I spent a lot of time preparing, putting this together, so I hope that tonight will be informative, at least for some of you. And there might be some of you that's really worked through this before, and some of this might just repetition, but I have a suspicion that for many of you, some of the information tonight will be rather new. And the goal here is simply to bring what is known in scholarly fields and the academic world, known by the research of people that study the Bible and its context, to bring it to people like me and you who really, really love the Bible, and I think who are in desperate need of the context of the scriptures we so much enjoy and which we really build our lives around. Anyway, so last week we spoke about it was just basically an introduction, but there were two things we spent a lot of time on, and the first was the idea of retrojective interpretation, and I used the example of a muffin. I think it's the best way to describe this. It's simply the idea that although we might sit today with fully baked muffins, theologies or doctrines, that the muffin wasn't always a muffin, but that basically it was wheat at some point that grew in the field, and it needed to be milled, and the wheat went through a very long process, and eventually sugar was added to that, and so the theologies we sit today actually developed over time. And I know this is not very instinctive for a lot of Christians. I know we all want to believe that the muffin has always existed. It's just not how the Bible works. And so getting your idea around the muffin is very important. So if you're joining us for the first time, I would suggest you stop this session right now and go back and watch the first one before we move on. So tonight, just want to carry on with our thought patterns. Tonight I've labeled Solomon the Polytheist, which is admittedly a rather, I think, what's the word I'm looking for, a provocative term. I like choosing provocative terms. I like to provoke to some degree. Anyway, but the point is just that we're going to be speaking about the First Temple period tonight and the nature of the religion of Israel in this very, very early period. Right, okay, so here we go. First Temple period is the period from around 950 BCE to about 586 BCE, and this spans the time from the time Solomon building the first temple according to the pattern that he, and the materials and the instruction of David, until the time that the Babylonians actually come and destroy this very important temple of the Jews. So this we call the First Temple period, the period in which the first temple exists. All right, so here we go. The question is, and this is the question I'm going to put to you tonight, and it might be rather counterintuitive, the answer to this, but the question is whether Israel during this First Temple period practiced a pure monotheism. And we're going to investigate this from the scriptures tonight, but also from some archaeology, to see what it looks like for us. Now, I know that many of you actually already know the answer to this, but no one has ever used the P word when it comes to Solomon. No one has ever dared, nobody from any pulpit I've been to and sat and listened to has ever dared to call Solomon a polytheist. It's rather embarrassing that the guy that wrote Proverbs possibly served more than one God, although we all knew he did. The question really rather for us is this just an isolated incident, or was this rather a pervasive general practice within the Israelites that lived in towns and in areas rather more remotely from Jerusalem itself? So many of us kind of default to the position of thinking that, Israel, from the time Moses got hold of them in the Exodus story, they kind of just turned monotheistic overnight. They heard what Moses said, and boom, Solomon, there you go. They were all monotheistic from that time on. And Solomon was just kind of like backsliding very late on, but they all just returned immediately after Solomon in the time of the reformers, Hezekiah and Josiah. the archaeological evidence and even some of the scriptural evidence actually tells us a different story. You will know that, whether you take the angle of Israel coming via Abraham into Egypt and then out, or whether, as some scholars suggest, you understand Israel as arising from the indigenous Canaanite peoples. The truth is that their history and that of most of humanity is rather polytheistic, and that to get out of it does not seem to be such an easy task. So we're going to be talking about the First Temple period, and this, of course, happens in the land of Canaan. Now, before the Israelites got there, the Canaanites were there, and you can read a lot about the Canaanites from the scriptures. But what a lot of Christians don't do is they don't read about Canaanite religion. And this is what comparative studies and a lot of very clever people have spent their life doing since we've unearthed some writings from Ugarit, which is in the very north of Canaan. We've learned a lot about what the Canaanites actually believed a long time before the Israelites arrived, or before the Israelites were a nation with a distinct identity within the land of Canaan. Right. So firstly, we're going to jump straight into this tonight. We want to have a quick look at the old Canaanite religion of that specific time, right? So I've attached a little appendix this today on the wall of this group, which if you have read, great. If you haven't, you can maybe go and read it a little bit later. Some extra information. I won't be able to cover all of that, but there's a lot of work that's actually being done concerning this, and there's a lot of ancient Ugaritic literature that this information comes from. So, what was this religion of the Canaanites like? Right, the Syro-Palestinian polytheistic mythology basically had basically had kind of 4 tiers. There was the authoritative tier, which was the high god. This god's name was El, E-L. Now, if you know the Bible, you already get a little bit hot around the collar. But anyway, this god's name was El, and this god had a wife or a consort, and her name was Asherah. Right, there's many names for her, and they slightly vary in pronunciation and writing. But for intensive purposes here tonight, we'll call her by the name Asherah. So this was like husband and wife, the high god, the one who has all the authority, the creator god, I guess, to some degree. And then you had the second tier. The second tier was the active or the patron gods. These are the gods that were appointed over specific areas. And they would be, like the Chaldeans, where Abram came from. Obviously, that's not Ugaritic, but they worshipped the moon goddess in that area. So gods were over specific areas. And the best examples of the patron or active tier gods in the Ugaritic pantheon was the god called Baal, and you'll know Baal just from scriptures, and his sister Anat, and there were many of them. Some of the literature indicates up to 70 of these sons of God, sons of El, who were allotted or appointed over geographical areas, and they kind of were running things for El. He was the main dude, the most high. He was sitting over them and kind of looking at what they're doing and, ruling through them, I guess. The interesting thing is that the collective word for these Baal type sons of God were commonly known as the Elohim. That's on the male sexual side, and on the female side was the Asterat. These are just terms which trigger a lot of memory for us as Christians. And then the third tier were the artisan gods. I don't know too much about this. I know just they were like in service of the gods. They made things. And there's one here, example, Kothar Wa Khasis. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but it's not going to be too important to us. And then lastly, in the fourth tier, was what was called the messenger gods. And these were basically gods without their own volition, meaning they didn't have their own will, and they were basically just servants taking messages from El, from Baal, to the people, the Canaanites. So you have these 4 tiers. It's basically a huge family. If it's strikingly similar to husband, wife, children, servants, and messengers. That's basically what it looked like. So the high god El here has a wife, possibly 7 sons, and these sons kind of form the council of the gods, together with the messenger gods that rule humanity. So we know even from the Bible, and this is where we start where it starts rubbing us a little bit the wrong way. But we know that one of the greatest threats to very early Israelite life was, in fact, Canaanite culture. And we find several warnings throughout books of Deuteronomy, books of the prophets, about Canaanite culture and Canaanite gods, and specifically Baal and Asherah, or Astaroth, as it's many times called in the in the Old Testament. Many warnings that the Israelites' greatest threat is that they would adopt this culture, that they would adopt this way of thinking. In fact, you could argue theologically that the very reason that northern Israel went into exile by the Assyrians in 720 BC and southern Israel went into exile to the Babylonians in 586 BC was exactly because they did that. They did follow and ended up following after other gods, ended up in spiritual harlotry, idolatry, as the scriptures then also so clearly indicate to us. The real problem comes when we see that there could have been an intertwining of the Canaanite religion with the Israel of religion and the religion of Israel, early religion of Israel. And this complicates things quite a lot for us once we've become aware of the Ugaritic literature and the archaeological finds. The problem is that in our Hebrew Bible, many times God is spoken of as El, or Elohim, or Elyon. And these words are used to describe Yahweh, the God of Israel. So this complicates things a little bit for us. I'm hoping to bring some clarity tonight on the issue. But let's just get back to Israel tonight. Did Israel worship other gods? And I think it's quite clear from the scriptures that there were definite polytheistic tendencies within Israel. We find it in some of the very older portions of the scriptures, and we're going to have a look at them tonight. But we also just find it clearly stated, explicitly stated in books like 1 Kings 11, which speaks about Solomon. So in 1 Kings 11, there's clear recorded account of King Solomon, the builder of the temple in Jerusalem. He continued to build high places for other gods and altars for other gods and all of his pagan wives. Now this dude had 700 wives. Most notable, he took the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. And so let me just read a little portion quickly for you from 1 Kings 11. I'm just checking my time here. 1 Kings 11 verse 5 and then 1 Kings 11, 7 to 8. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Verse 7. Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemos, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives. In other words, here's 4, but all the strange wives, he did the same for them. Whatever god they worshipped, he built an altar for them. I mean, the guy was busy. Which burnt incense and sacrificed unto their gods. So it seems like this was kind of part of Solomon's modus operandi. And a lot of us revere Solomon for his great wealth and his great wisdom. He wrote Proverbs, after all. But the reality is that most of Solomon's life look, unfortunately, like he was a polytheist. Just quickly on some of these gods. Firstly, the most important one for us tonight is Ashtaroth, which is a Phoenician principal deity, Phoenician also meaning Canaanite, principal deity of war and love, also known as Asherah. And she's associated also with, and this is just a lot of words, but maybe for some of you this will mean something, with Ishtar of Assyria and Astarte of the Greeks and the Romans. In other words, she's also associated with the Queen of Heaven we find in Jeremiah. And there was it seems like a ubiquitous idea in the Levant, but also in the near ancient East, that whichever the god was, Anu or El, always had a wife. In other words, how would they produce the sons of God? How would they produce more gods? I think was the logic there. And her name kind of changed. But she seems to be very much a ubiquitous figure right throughout the ancient Near Eastern times, into the Levant, and also bleeding into Israel itself. Then there was Milcom of the Amorites, the Phoenicians, and one of the scary things about Milcom was exactly this, that Israel would sacrifice children to this god in the valley of Hinnom. For those of you, just very, very side random note, Valley of Hinnom translates to Gehenna in the New Testament, which is the real word that English translators translated as hell. That's a little bit of an extra thing here. Then we have Chemos of Moab, Shemos or Chemos of Moab. Later, he was identified with Baal Peor, Baal Zebub, Mars, and even Saturn. So you can see how these gods almost just through syncretism, they kind of just change names as time goes on. And then there was the famous Molech of Ammon. And once again here, the Israelites sacrificed, no, I wouldn't say all of the Israelites, but there were instances where they sacrificed their children to Molech in the Valley of Hinnom. The same valley, this Valley of Hinnom is a valley on the eastern side of Jerusalem. Back to the scriptures. Now, you might remember King Manasseh. And in the scriptures, he is also referred to as someone who went after the abominations of the heathen. He rebuilt the high places which his father Hezekiah destroyed. Now, Hezekiah is known as one of the reformer kings in Judah. And Hezekiah is known for breaking down altars, high places in around the temple and throughout Judah. These were built and obviously were in some form of practice in Judah during the First Temple period. But Manasseh, after Hezekiah dies, his son Manasseh comes and he rebuilds all these things. It's like they have a bit of a revelation in Hezekiah, and the moment he dies, they just kind of start rebuilding all of these things again, all of these high places and so on. Manasseh rebuilt the altar to Baal and an Asherah. So here we see a very clear indication that the Israelites, to some degree, and it is not always clear that they completely forsaken the worship to Yahweh, but it seems like these were things in addition. For instance, in Solomon's life, it's mentioned that he would 3 times a year sacrifice to Yahweh. But at the same time, he's building altars to Asherah, to Shemosh, to Molech, etc., etc. Okay. So, Manasseh is mentioned to build or rebuild altars to Baal, to Asherah, worshipping and serving, the Bible says, worshipping and serving the host of heaven. And I just want to put a pin in this for a moment here. Worshipping the host of heaven here does not mean, the host of heaven is not angels. King Manasseh wasn't worshipping angels. The host of heaven here is referring to the Canaanite type and polytheistic way of thinking about the gods. There's a god with his wife and so many children, up to 70 of these gods that actually kind of rule. These are the hosts of heaven. That might include servant gods or messenger gods of the Canaanite pantheon. But the point here is host of heaven here is not, well, let me put it this way. It's very important to note that host of heaven here most probably refers to the Canaanite way, the polytheistic Canaanite way, serving Baal and Asherah. Okay, we'll get to that term a little bit later. And the point also there is just simply that, and this is in 2 Kings 21, 1-9, if you want to follow up on it, that he thoroughly embraced pagan practices. It wasn't just a little bit of a sacrifice now and then, if you know what I mean. Like he kind of set the whole system up. He set an image of Asherah in the temple in Jerusalem. Now this is getting crazy because, you know, why is a king allowed to put a second god into the temple, like a statue of a second god into the temple? Asherah, what in the world is going on here? What are you thinking? Have you completely forgotten about Moses and the law? And so what is interesting is that Asherah is there, right? And then it says that this continued to seduce the people to do the same type of thing. And they did eventually. 2 Kings 21, 1-9 says that they became more evil than the Canaanites. And this is specifically with reference to the worship of many gods. So this is just kind of like evidence from the biblical viewpoint that it seems like in the First Temple period, Solomon and many of the kings, this was modus operandi default for most of these guys. And if you consider that the anointed king is doing these things, you could assume, you'd be forgiven to assume that the normal guys on the street were just doing the same thing. No, there were no riots. Hezekiah wasn't overthrown because he put an Asherah in the temple to Yahweh. These things were accepted. And it seems to me very safe to reason that this was simply because Israel had not shifted completely out from polytheism, but they were living in a type of a mixture, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, in a type of a mixture between ancient Canaanite religion, which was thoroughly polytheistic, and what would later become a monotheistic, purely monotheistic Judaism, where only Yahweh was acknowledged and worshipped, of course. Okay, so I don't know how much of this I need to say, but let me leave it at that. Okay, so I want to speak a moment on those little figurines. I sent a photo of them through to you earlier today on the group wall. Those little things there, as I mentioned, they're not early Israeli pornography. They are, in fact, figurines of the goddess Asherah. And how we kind of know that these aren't just toys is they always holding their breasts. You know, every example of Asherah, and also of the other examples of the Queen of Heaven, or Astarte, or Ishtar, or the Egyptian or the Mesopotamian versions of this goddess, they're always holding the breast because it is an indicator of fertility. Fertility and war, I understood her to be the patron of, right? So here's the interesting thing. Those figurines that you see in that picture, now in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem, they were found somewhere, and this is this. Let me read this for you. Astarte or Asherah figurines were found all over settlements in Jehuda, in Judah, in around the 8th and 7th centuries, but mainly in private dwellings. More than, listen to this, 1 per household is estimated. So these things were everywhere. More than this is fact, more than 2,000 were found in Jerusalem. Hold on, what? Well, you know, I know this might be a shock. It was a shock to me, but we just read that they put one of these in the temple. So, I mean, should we really be shocked? I guess not. But these were from the Iron Age kingdom of Judah. And these figurines were associated with the fertility due to their large breasts, and were used in private cultic activity. Once the Judeans, and this is very interesting, and this is going to tie into our later session, so maybe just make a note of this somewhere in the back of your head. But once the Judeans come back from Israel, these figurines disappear from the archaeological record completely. So this is I'm going to say this because I think this is very valuable, that in the first temple period, these figurines are everywhere. 1 per household is the estimation. 2,000 in Jerusalem. That's crazy business. That's not one person here and there rebelling. We're talking about a practice of almost every household. But something happens in the exile. Something happens just before or during the exile, or possibly once they return from the exile, that these figurines are no longer found. So this is an important indicator for us of, I think, the evolving faith of the Israelites, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. So Asherah in the ancient Semitic religions was a fertility goddess of sexual love and war, appearing in numerous ancient sources, and it's everywhere. It's easy to research as well. She is identified as the consort or the wife of, for instance, the Sumerian god Anu, which Sumerian religion's one of the oldest religions on the earth, but also the Ugaritic high god El, which is associated with Canaanite or Phoenician life and religion. The Ugaritic Canaanite god, the Ugaritic high god El, the oldest deities in their respective pantheons. Okay. Now here's the shocking thing that maybe you have never thought of, maybe no one's ever said this, maybe you have picked it up yourself. But the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, the name Asherah appears 40 times in the Hebrew scriptures. 40 times in the Hebrew scriptures. Although in our English translation, the impact is much reduced, as they often translate the word Asherah as a grove. And she is also then identified with Jeremiah's Queen of Heaven. You can read about that in Jeremiah 7:16-18, also 44:17-19, and verse 25. So she's all over the Old Testament, this figure. A little bit more evidence from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. Josiah is reported. Now, Josiah was this reformer king, very young reformer king that arrives. I'm not sure, 100% sure of the date. I'm assuming late 7th century, or somewhere in the 7th century. I think late 7th century. In Jerusalem, he becomes king in Judah, and he, like Hezekiah, which was before him, is seen to try and produce some reforms. And what happens in Josiah's time is, the Bible tells us that he finds a book of the law somewhere in the temple while he was busy with temple reforms. And in there, he again sees the law. He sees that there should only be one God, and that Israelitic religion should really be monotheistic. And what really happens is this sparks a huge campaign against all forms of polytheism. Once again, like in Hezekiah's time, similar, against all forms of Asherah, Baal, and whatever gods were served at the time. So Josiah is reporting as cutting down the statues of Asherah in the temple that Solomon built, the temple that Solomon built for Yahweh. This is in 2 Kings 23:14. Josiah's grandfather Manasseh had erected one such statue, and we've already discussed that a little bit earlier on. Let me read a portion from Judges 3:7. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God, where there's Yahweh their God, or Yahweh their El, I think, and worshipping the Baals and the Asherahs. So Hosea 11 verse 2, and this is a little bit of extra. The more I called them, the more they went from me. This is God speaking through Hosea. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to the idols. So it does seem to us, it seems to most people who investigate this thoroughly, that there was a general accepted practice of polytheism in the First Temple period, which later, for some reason, during the exile, and we'll speak about that a little bit later, under pressure from other elements, seemed to die out. But in this very early phase, and that's the phase we're focusing on tonight, in this very early phase, polytheism seemed to have been almost the default, and the Hezekiahs and the Josiahs were the anomalies that were trying to pull the people back into the monotheistic or the Yahweh only worship, which is, I believe, the form of worship that the Bible ultimately promotes. Just a last little bit of quite disturbing information. This was really disturbing for me. It took me a while to get my head around this and to eventually accept it. Is that archaeologists also find an 8th century BCE inscription. It was discovered in a place which name I could barely pronounce. Kuntilet Ajrot. It was found in the northern Sinai desert on a storage jar with the inscription. And here's the inscription. The inscription says, Yahweh of Samaria. Now, Samaria, of course, was the northern kingdom, which is a little bit earlier than just Judah, but it's not Judah itself, but it is still Israel, of course. Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. So this is a very, very interesting little thing here. You might say, it's a potsherd, who cares about a storage jar? But the reality back then is most probably like less than 2% of the people could actually read and write. And it wasn't just your average guy writing on storage jars. These were educated people writing things that needed to be, for important purposes and for the longevity of ideas and of religious ideas specifically. So finding a potsherd or a storage jar with this on it is actually hugely significant, especially after we know that these goddesses were everywhere, and the Bible itself mentions that she was a real problem for the early Israelites. In addition to this inscription, Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, there is also found one that says Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. And another one, a potsherd, inscripted with this, blessings from Yahweh and his Asherah. Now, these might be slightly isolated, but the point here is simply that it is not far-fetched to consider the reality that Asherah was not just another god for the Israelites, but they kind of believed, like everyone around them, that God had to have a wife and God's wife had to be, or could possibly be Asherah. So it's not far-fetched to draw those type of conclusions. Now please, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not trying to tell you today that the Bible actually approves of and condones and encourages the, number one, the worship of many gods, or of Asherah, or the idea that God had a wife. Absolutely not. The Bible says, or points us in the opposite direction. But it is important, for the purposes of reading the Bible honestly, that we do acknowledge that the Israel that we love so much, the Israel of First Temple period, the place we wish we could be, close to King David, actually wasn't a rosy picture. It was rather a picture that was really struggling with the idea of monotheism and struggling to come to terms with it. And in practice, I know what the scripture tells us to do, or told them to believe, but in practice things actually looked rather different. And this is now accepted by most scholars, that First Temple period Israeli religion, which is called Yahwism, was largely polytheistic. And so this is important, and I'll at the end of tonight I will spend a couple of moments on why this is so important to us, because all of you might be wondering by now, where's Satan? What's going on? This is a thing about Satan. Well, as I said earlier in the last session, the development of Israel's theology seems to be driving the development of the idea of Satan. And unless we understand what the Israelites in their cultural memory and their cultural consciousness was actually practicing and how they thought, we can't understand how they thought about the idea of Satan either. Okay, so I want to just have a quick look of how much I still need to do tonight. Actually got quite a lot to get through here, so I'm going to rush very ever so slightly. So the Hebrew scriptures themselves also, and this is a very important concept for me. It took me a very long time to come to terms with it, research it, and to accept this type of thinking. And I know it's slightly shocking to most people who just read the Bible from the Christian perspective all the time, assuming the muffin was there in the beginning. And the whole point is to say, no, actually there wasn't a muffin, it was wheat that later became a muffin, right? Okay, you got that. But the Hebrew scriptures themselves also allude to a far and a distant past, where the belief of more than one God for the Israelites did exist. And this was, and we pick up these terms, we pick up in the scriptures the term called the heavenly divine council, right? Or family of the gods, in which Yahweh was the primary deity of the God family. But that he also had sons, we call the sons of God. Now, many of you, as I say the term sons of God, some of you have been in the apostolic too long, you think of us. That's not what is meant here. Many of us have just concluded sons of God have to be angels. But in fact, this in the ancient context, in the Canaanite context, sons of God actually meant something. And it literally meant the sons of gods, sons of God, of the high God. In other words, these were gods, but they were the sons of the high God, that ruled in proxy kind of for the high God. Okay, so they are also often called, and we mentioned this a little bit earlier, the host of heaven, gods or sons of gods, but also holy ones. And so these are the terms we find in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, that refer to this idea that even within the scripture, and this might be hard for some of you to get your head around, but even in our precious, inspired scripture, there are ancient references to a time when Israel believed that there was more than one God. All right? I want to give you some examples. I can't be exhaustive in this short session here tonight. Maybe go read the document I've put up, and if you have more questions, pop them through to me. I'll be very happy to try and answer them as far as I can. So here's some of the examples. The old Psalm 82 verse 1 to 2. Here's how it reads. Elohim, I'm going to try and read the Hebrew words for God so we can get some distinction. Elohim stands in the congregation of the El. He judges amongst the Elohim. So here is a rather clear, if we read it for what it says, God stands amongst the gods and he judges amongst the gods. Now, it's pretty plain, pretty plain. I know many of you, we've read this. I've read this. I've interpreted this in many ways. I've interpreted this previously saying, no, this is obviously us as humans and God wants us to take control. And, it could be some future spiritual idea in there, but you can't squeeze the muffin back into this wheat here. This is an ancient understanding that God was actually God over the sons of God. And there are more portions that do this. For instance, and I just have time for 3 more tonight. There are not many, I will say that. There are not many, but the more clearer ones are these ones. So here's one in Psalm 89 and verse 6. For who in heaven can be compared unto Yahweh? Who among the sons of God can be likened unto Yahweh? Okay, so it's rather complicated here, and I think it speaks of a little bit of a different time. But the point here is there is an acknowledgement here that Yahweh is amongst the sons of God, but that none of them can compare to him. All right? This is kind of what you get when you read this in a very plain sense. Then there's, of course, the ancient idea of Job, and you know this, and when I read this, you're going to know what I'm about to say. But Job 1 verse 6 says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan was amongst them. All right, so wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, here we have the same kind of situation as we find in these previous 2 verses, where some of the writings in our scriptures indicate a time when people believed that God had some form of a council of divine beings called the sons of God, and he used them. He had meetings with them. It was a council. They sat down and discussed things. And this is the meeting where Satan appears and wants to make trouble with Job, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So I don't want to go too much into that. But these are some of the portions from the scriptures itself that indicates an older time. Now here's the most interesting one of all of them, and this is found in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, regarded to be one of the oldest portions in the scripture, because it reflects a time, I've got to be very careful with my words here, but a very long time ago. And I don't want to cause any trouble here, but this is what it seems like. It reflects a very old time back, when Yahweh was one of the sons of God, and Jacob was his allotted portion. Jacob, Israel, was the nation he was a portion to, that he was supposed to look after for the high God Elion. Now I know that might seem a horrible thought to you, but let me read it for you quickly. It says, when the Most High here is Elion, divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now, this is where it gets slightly interesting, because, I think it's in my note that I attached today, is a long commentary on this little portion here, and specifically the term, the children of Israel. Because the Masoretic text, which is the text we get our Hebrew Bible from, it's about 1,000 years old, says children of Israel, but the older versions of the Hebrew scripture, for instance, the older versions of the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Bible, translated from a much older Hebrew version than the Masoretic text, in around the 2nd century, from the 2nd century BCE through to maybe 1st century or 2nd century CE, says sons of God. And so also do the Qumran, which is from, I think, the Dead Sea Scrolls, another version of the same, much older than the Hebrew we have, says sons of God. Now this is, when you read it, then it sounds like this. Let me read it for you one more time. I'll check my time here. Okay, so don't want to spend too much time. But when the Most High, Elion, divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the sons of God. For Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob, or Israel, is the lot of his inheritance. Now, I mentioned previously that the Canaanite pantheon operated in this way. There was a high God that apportioned land or geographic areas and nations to the sons of God, and they needed to look after these areas. This is a portion of scripture which seems to indicate that there must have been some cultural memory within Israel, a very old one at that, where Yahweh was one of these gods who received Israel as his portion. Now remember, this is what we believe they thought. We don't necessarily agree with what they thought. Right. The point is this: these scriptures, together with the archaeological finds, paint a very unexpected picture of God amongst the gods, or the sons of gods. And actually a very familiar picture when it comes to the Canaanite pantheon. And so what we could postulate as a possible, that's going to sound crazy, but a possible pantheon for the Israelites during the first temple period was Yahweh and possibly Asherah, his wife. The sons of God is a type of a divine council over which Yahweh ruled. Some form of the servants of gods. I'm not sure what that would be. But then lastly also, of course, the messengers of God, which would be very much like the angels, angel meaning messenger. People, messengers, servants who don't have their own will but go and do the will, send the message, take the message of God. Okay, as crazy as all of this might sound to you, it does seem that the early monarchic period, the time of the kings, was largely polytheistic. And Deuteronomy is exactly this. It's a call out from such period, a polytheistic practice, possibly in the time of Josiah, and back to the covenant of Moses, trying to bring the Israelites back to a pure monotheism. This is, of course, what the prophets do very, very proudly and prominently, and we'll get to some of that. So I'm not suggesting the overall instruction of the scriptures is to validate polytheism. On the contrary, it is absolutely not. But it does show us the steps of the journey they traveled to eventually rid polytheism from amongst them. The reality is just that they seem not to always be fully compliant to the demands of God on them. In fact, we know that they weren't. As far as I can see, there are three reasons why we as ordinary readers of the Hebrew scriptures, me and you, modern day English versions, seem to miss this ancient polytheistic possibility. And I'm just going to read this because I'm slightly out of time here. Number one, we don't expect it because we somehow assume, or we've been taught indirectly, that the Israelites were always monotheistic the moment they stepped foot out of Egypt. And this is kind of where the muffin comes in. And this is basically us retrospectively interpreting those scriptures as if they were monotheistic because they were later monotheistic, right? Secondly, the much larger than first expected relation of the Torah during a time, the much larger than expected reduction, redaction of the Torah during a time in which the prophets spoke out harshly against polytheism, together with the Deuteronomistic reforms of someone like King Josiah, placed pressure on the writers to portray a monotheistic picture of the past. Thus, they were, from a later time, projecting their monotheistic persuasions, beliefs sincerely back into the older scriptures, making those older scriptures take the form of the redactors, because they wanted people to see and live in a monotheistic light. This was done in a sincere good faith. But thus it smooths over some of the very dark ancient reality that Israel was largely polytheistic up until the time of the exile. And I'm going to leave out the idea of Abraham here for time's sake. I've got 2 minutes. Thirdly, and I'm working through the reasons why it's not so obvious to us modern readers. Thirdly, our own modern translators seem to want to ignore or smooth out these embarrassing ideas, beliefs, and practices found in the Hebrew scriptures. It is embarrassing to consider that the Psalms we are regarded as inspired places God in the council of gods without explaining it or saying, I'm just kidding. Unless you understand the ancient context it comes from, and we are willing to leave it there, knowing that we, in our understanding of God, have to move on just like the Israelites had to do. So, First Temple Israelite religion, called Yahwism, was largely polytheistic. They still believed in many gods and still worshipped and sacrificed to these gods, including Yahweh. So what? So what's this got to do with Satan? Okay. To run slightly ahead of ourselves, and I'm ending off with this tonight. Transitioning from polytheism into monotheism, which we'll see in our, in session 4. Although we might this consider as good and right, and as what we see in the scriptures, what we would expect, it also brings with it some serious theological implications. Not least of these being the following. If there is only one God, and He is good, where does all the calamity in the world come from? See, where polytheism had no need for such considerations. Somehow calamity or the loss in war came from some rogue god of the Ammonites, or maybe from the result of us not worshipping all the gods equally, or some rogue god being angered created an earthquake somewhere. They could explain evil and calamity in terms of some other god, because there were so many of them. The problem is that when you step into monotheism, things change. And when you now consider that there is only one God, who's responsible for the earthquake that just killed 3 million people? Who's responsible for the flood? Who's responsible for this? There's no God to point to anymore. And so this is what we need to talk about. And so this is what we're going to be doing next week. Next week we're going to look at, in this polytheistic time of the Israel early First Temple period religion, what does the Bible say about Satan? Okay, so now this is where the tire is gonna hit the road. What does that period, in this period where Israel in practice seemed to be largely polytheistic, what are their ideas about Satan? How does Satan work in polytheism? And the way we're going to be exploring this is by actually going to the very scriptures that we can see that roughly falls within this time. So that's what we'll be doing next week. So the question for next week is simple. How would a largely polytheistic culture think of Satan? Right. So next week we're going to be doing that. And so we are going to be talking about the Satan of the First Temple Yahwism. Guys, I'm going to leave you, and I'm slightly over my time. I just want to leave you with one last little thought. Those who changed their vote on the poll after last week's session, you are the real muffins in this group. Right, have an awesome week, and I'll see you next week.